Transparency was again one of the big issues that kept surfacing and has surfaced over and over. What really stood out to you as far as this particular meeting of the Southern Baptist Convention related to the transparency issues?
I think the concern is just the unwillingness for transparency, and that inevitably causes concern from anybody who's giving tithes or offerings to the convention in any capacity. It raises red flags, even if there isn't anything happening behind the scenes. We don't know, and there is no way of knowing, no mechanism for the way of knowing. And so, when you feel, obligated to steward God's, money, particularly within the context of the church, that raises a lot of concerns, and it causes churches to want to withhold funds in those circumstances. And I think they rightfully should, because if we're called to be stewards of God's resources, then we need to know where those resources are going and what they're being used for.
Yeah, I fully agree. My guess is in the church where you're pastor, people know how the money's being spent. And same thing in church where I'm transitional pastor right now, and every church I've ever pastored, that's been very clear. In fact, I'm just thinking back. I mean, I served in an association for a decade, worked in the state convention as the executive director. All of those levels of participation and cooperation in the SBC, we were very open and transparent about how the money was being spent. And it is quite disturbing, at this point to see the lack of transparency. I don't think anybody is really calling for let's see every check kind of transparency. That's not necessary particularly, but there are some real concerns. One of the things that tied back into transparency that really jumped to the forefront in this particular year was an issue that arose with, well, let's just say the North American Mission Board's booth. And they've been in the news a lot anyway, a lot of things going on. But let me show a quick clip, and then let's talk a little bit about how this surfaced and exactly what it says to us about what's happening in the SBC and particularly at the North American Mission Board.
You can go also by our booth if you'd like. We have a race car there, and we're open to giving anyone $10,000 if you can get it started, all right? Doesn't have a motor.
Once again, this was an issue. Of course, initially, some were saying that NAMB had basically sponsored a car, which I never really thought that. I thought that would be insane, and that's buku hundreds of dollars. I don't know if that's a real phrase or not, but that's a lot of money. But the questions did start coming back. I mean, that's something that, especially being located in Indy, a lot of big trade shows come into the convention center, other kinds of things. There are groups that do rentals of this kind of thing. And that eventually was what surfaced, is that this was a rental, but a huge amount of cost involved in something like this, everything from the design of what's being put on that car, but the wrap and everything else. And as you saw in that very brief clip with a few photos, it said powered by Annie Armstrong on it, and of course the NAMB logo, that kind of thing. And so many were concerned that Annie Armstrong dollars were being spent for this. I kind of feel like the marketing approach, the idea was, hey, you give to Annie Armstrong and we're all about, sending missionaries, a little bit more holistic. I don't think it was just trying to say that this was spent from Annie Armstrong money. Because, of course, 100% of what is given to Annie Armstrong is supposed to go directly to the field. The problem is the lack of transparency, and people question that. People question, is all of our money going there? Because NAMB has been so secretive about exactly how they're, spending the money, whether it be 60 million, 80 million, 90 million, 100 million that's being put into the coffers as far as church planting. How is that being spent? Well, we have gotten reports about millions of dollars being spent on houses and providing houses, some of them quite luxury. You know, in Arizona, I think there was a house that was $750,000, had a huge pool in the backyard and all that. I mean, just a lot of just kind of insane things. And then the evidence has come out that some of those expenditures has not been really for church planters, and it wasn't in the sin cities, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, I could go on. There's a lot of issues about this, but the real key was the issue of transparency and not being willing to say, well, this was what our budget was for the convention, and this is what we spent. This was all within what we budgeted for that. At that point, what was your thoughts? What was your impression about this particular issue?
Yeah, well, just kind of like what you're articulating there, that it was kind of a perfect storm of, it should have been a little bit on their part, that should have been a little more prudent, a little more wise as to maybe their choice of marketing. I'm not opposed to marketing at all. Even in this context, it isn't that there's anything wrong with marketing and getting our attention, helping raise funds for particular goals, and helping to communicate what your role is, and funding church planting, for instance, or say, or at the IMB, we were going for missions. You know, you're promoting these sorts of things, and that's good. It's not necessarily bad in of itself, but the timing was really terrible. It almost makes you wonder if they realize the concerns that others are having as it relates to the transparency, particularly with NAMB, especially wondering how much people are being paid, or as some of the examples you were giving as well. And it just was really bad timing. I think there was probably some assumptions made by others looking outside, and how much was being spent on the car. And I don't know how much was spent. I was following via Twitter and watching people taking pictures of it and making comments on it. And it seemed like little bits of information of, not having an engine in the car, and that it was rented, and things like that were making it maybe less of an egregious issue than it was initially made to be. But it probably wasn't the wisest of marketing moves on their part, given the time.
Yeah, especially the high sensitivity of people who are so concerned about how the money's being spent and what we've not been able to find out. I mean, just like the salaries of the entity heads and, all those kind of things. And that kind of goes back to the Rhett Burns motion that was presented last year, was sent to the EC, which is a normal kind of procedure to send things over to the EC or to the entity to be dealt with. And the EC looked at it, evaluated it several different times. In their February meeting, they refused to act on it, postponed acting on it until their June meeting, which is right before the convention, obviously, or the annual meeting. And then they decided not to bring it to the floor for action. And it basically was asking for 990 level type transparency, which incidentally, if people don't know, this is the normal kind of filing, transparent filing that nonprofit organizations do all the time. It is filed with the IRS, and many organizations like take Franklin Graham's organization, Billy Graham organization, those kinds of organizations, they all file a 990. So you can go and find it. It's public record. Nobody was asking, including Rhett Burns in his motion, that this be made a filing to the IRS. He's just asking for similar type revelation, transparency, just like Planned Parenthood or any other nonprofit has to do, that at least our entities would be at least that forthcoming. IMB president, Paul Chitwood, came out and basically said, hey, look, we don't want to support that at all because it would put our missionaries in danger. And Burns has been very, very clear that is not the case. And they're not asking for those locations of missionaries or what every missionary makes to be revealed. But the top executives, yes. What about grants being received? That would be something should be revealed. Are there outside funds coming in? What's the ties with that? And, the Center for Baptist Leadership, the new Center for Baptist Leadership led by William Wolf, actually did a kind of a parallel. It wasn't part of the SBC per se, wasn't SBC sponsored, but it was around the SBC so people could attend. And some 800 or 900 people were in attendance and heard Megan Basham, the reporter from Daily Wire, who presented content from her forthcoming book. But much of the ties tying the ERLC to a lot of kind of questionable funding, money that's coming in, sponsoring grants and research and other kinds of things. So I think it was just an insensitive move. Understanding it's very expensive to do this kind of a trade show, setup. Those displays that all of the organizations that display put up, it's not cheap. But it seemed like this particular part of the display, even though it tied in with Indy, they should have done a paper mache race car or something. I don't know, something that obviously didn't look quite so expensive, I guess you could say, at that point.